I have spent my career analysing geopolitical catastrophes, but nothing has prepared me for the spectacular sight of watching Germany, the industrial titan that rebuilt itself from literal rubble into Europe's undisputed economic powerhouse, stumble into its third consecutive year of recession, while setting a record that surpasses even the darkest chapters of post-war history. The Handelsblatt Research Institute has delivered a verdict that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. Germany is experiencing the greatest crisis of the post-war era. 3 consecutive years of economic contraction, minus 0.3% in 2024, minus 0.2% in 2024, and a projected minus 0.1% for 2025 represent the longest period of economic stagnation since the country emerged from the ashes of World War II. This isn't merely a statistical blip or cyclical downturn, it's the systematic dismantling of an economic model that once seemed indestructible. Germany, the nation that transformed Made in Germany from a 19th century protectionist slur into the global gold standard of engineering excellence, now stands like a once dominant athlete who suddenly discovers that his legendary skills have evaporated while everyone else has somehow become faster, smarter and more innovative. The German Chamber of Commerce warns of further deindustrialization, a phrase that would have been considered economic heresy during the miracle years when Germany exported prosperity to the world. What makes this collapse particularly fascinating is that Germany's decline wasn't caused by external disasters or unpredictable black swan events, but rather by a masterfully executed series of strategic blunders that collectively represent a textbook case study in how to systematically destroy your own economy while convincing yourself you're implementing progressive leadership. The irony is so thick you could export it as premium German engineering. The country that spent decades lecturing other European nations about fiscal responsibility and economic competence has managed to sabotage itself through a combination of energy policy fantasies, bureaucratic paralysis, and strategic myopia that would make even the most incompetent autocrats shake their heads in bewilderment. Take Germany's energy strategy, which reads like a masterpiece of economic self-harm disguised as environmental leadership. German policymakers decided to simultaneously eliminate nuclear power and terminate their dependence on Russian natural gas, without developing any coherent plan for maintaining industrial competitiveness during this transition. This is roughly equivalent to deciding to quit your job and divorce your spouse on the same day while having no savings, backup plan, or alternative living arrangements, theoretically defensible as lifestyle optimization, practically guaranteed to result in spectacular personal destruction. The Germans sold this strategy to their public as energy vendor, the energy transition, a term that sounds impressively technical and forward-thinking until you realise it was essentially a plan to replace reliable low-cost energy sources with expensive intermittent alternatives, while hoping that industrial physics would somehow accommodate political aspirations. German politicians spent years rhapsodizing about renewable energy leadership while constructing an industrial economy that depended entirely on cheap Russian gas as backup power for wind and solar. Installations that worked only when weather conditions cooperated with manufacturing schedules. Putin's invasion of Ukraine then exposed this strategy as the economic equivalent of building your house on quicksand during an earthquake. Germany's dependence on Russian energy wasn't just significant, it was existentially critical to everything that made the German economy competitive. Russian gas didn't just heat German homes, it powered the chemical plants that produced industrial inputs, the steel mills that forged automotive components, and the manufacturing facilities that created the high-value exports that funded Germany's generous social system and European leadership ambitions. When Russian energy supplies suddenly vanished, German industrial costs didn't just increase, they exploded to levels that made German manufacturing instantly uncompetitive with producers in China, the United States and virtually everywhere else on Earth. Energy-intensive industries that had operated profitably for decades suddenly found themselves paying 4 times as much for electricity as their international competitors, essentially guaranteeing that production would either stop entirely or relocate to countries with more sensible energy policies. Robert Habeck, Germany's Green Party economics minister, responded to this predictable crisis by accusing friendly nations of charging astronomical prices for replacement energy supplies, apparently forgetting that he had spent years advocating for the very policies that created Germany's energy vulnerability. This is roughly like setting your own house on fire and then complaining that hotel rooms are overpriced. Technically accurate, but revealing a fundamental misunderstanding of cause and effect: relationships. Meanwhile, Germany's legendary bureaucratic efficiency has transformed into a nightmare of regulatory complexity that systematically strangles innovation while rewarding conformity and risk aversion. German entrepreneurs report approval processes that require years rather than months, environmental assessments that cost more than entire startup budgets, and regulatory requirements, so complex that navigating them requires teams of specialized lawyers who charge fees that exceed most companies' projected revenues. The digitalization failure compounds every other structural weakness while revealing Germany's fundamental inability to adapt to 21st century economic realities. While China and the United States invested massively in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, 5G infrastructure, and digital platforms that now dominate global commerce, Germany was forming committees to discuss data protection regulations for email communications and debating whether cloud computing violated European digital sovereignty principles. German banks still process international transactions using paper-based systems that Chinese fintech companies automated years ago. German government services require physical paperwork for procedures that Estonian startups can complete through smartphone applications. German corporations lag so catastrophically behind in digital adoption that they seem like telegraph operators trying to compete in a broadband internet economy, technically proficient at obsolete technologies while remaining completely mystified by the systems that now drive global commerce. China represents an existential threat that German policymakers still refuse to acknowledge with appropriate seriousness. For decades, Germany operated what seemed like the perfect global trade relationship. Import cheap Chinese intermediate products and components, add German engineering value, then export finished goods back to China and the rest of the world at premium prices. This arrangement generated enormous profits while allowing German executives to congratulate themselves on their sophisticated global supply chain optimization strategies. But China has systematically climbed the value chain with a precision and speed that makes German engineering processes look glacially slow and embarrassingly predictable. Chinese companies no longer content themselves with manufacturing components according to German specifications. They now design superior products, develop better manufacturing processes, and compete directly with German brands in markets that Germany previously dominated without serious competition. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers like BYD produce cars that are not only significantly cheaper than German alternatives, but technologically superior in crucial areas like battery performance, software integration, and charging infrastructure compatibility. So German automakers who spent decades perfecting internal combustion engines suddenly find themselves competing against Chinese companies that mastered electric powertrains, while German engineers were still debating whether electric vehicles represented a temporary fad or permanent market transition. The broader implications extend beyond automotive manufacturing into every sector where German companies previously enjoyed technological leadership. Machine tools, precision instruments, chemical products, manufacturing equipment industries where German superiority was considered permanent and unassailable now face Chinese competitors who combine lower production costs with innovation cycles that make German product development seem bureaucratically constipated and strategically confused. German political dysfunction has reached levels that would embarrass developing democracies struggling with basic governance challenges. The traffic light coalition government under Olaf Scholz collapsed in November 2024 after years of internal disputes over budget policy, constitutional debt restrictions, and investment priorities had rendered the administration incapable of making coherent decisions about anything more complicated than lunch orders. The Constitutional Court's declaration that a €60 billion climate fund violated legal spending requirements further constrained an already paralysed budget process, effectively eliminating any possibility of significant public investment in infrastructure, modernisation, digital transformation or industrial competitiveness programmes. The result is political uncertainty at precisely the moment when Germany desperately needs decisive leadership and massive public investments to restore economic competitiveness. German companies have responded to this uncertainty by postponing expansion plans, cutting research and development budgets, and increasingly relocating production facilities to countries with more predictable policy environments. 60% of German businesses now identify economic policy conditions as their primary business risk, a devastating indictment that illustrates how thoroughly German political dysfunction has undermined business confidence in the country's economic future. Labour market indicators tell an equally disturbing story that challenges fundamental assumptions about German economic resilience. Unemployment has increased to 6.0%, while short-time work arrangements have expanded by 13%, suggesting that companies are preparing for extended periods of reduced economic activity. Most significantly, more German companies now plan workforce reductions than expect to create new employment opportunities, a fundamental shift that indicates how deeply structural problems have penetrated the German economy. The demographic catastrophe adds another layer of complexity that compounds every other economic challenge while creating fiscal pressures that threaten the sustainability of Germany's entire social model. Germany's birth rate ranks among the world's lowest, while rapid population ageing creates a dependency ratio that makes funding pension systems, healthcare costs, and social programs, increasingly difficult without massive tax increases or benefit reductions that would trigger social unrest. The automotive industry that once symbolized German engineering supremacy now faces an existential crisis that encompasses technological disruption, Chinese competition, and fundamental shifts in global consumer preferences toward electric mobility solutions that German manufacturers adopted reluctantly and belatedly. Volkswagen's consideration of factory closures represents more than cost-cutting measures. It acknowledges that traditional German automotive business models may no longer be commercially viable in rapidly evolving global markets. From a geopolitical perspective, Germany confronts impossible choices between American security partnerships and Chinese commercial relationships that previously seemed compatible but now require explicit prioritization that will necessarily alienate important allies or trading partners. The end of the post-Cold War period, when Germany could simultaneously benefit from American military protection and Chinese economic opportunities, forces decisions that German policymakers spent decades avoiding through diplomatic ambiguity and strategic hedging. European implications magnify every aspect of Germany's crisis because the entire continental project depends on German economic strength to provide stability, funding, and leadership for European integration initiatives. If Germany cannot solve its structural problems and restore economic growth, the European Union loses its financial anchor and political core, potentially triggering a cascade of crises that could fundamentally reshape European geopolitics for generations. Looking ahead, three scenarios appear most probable, each carrying profound implications for European stability and global economic relationships that extend far beyond Germany's borders. The first scenario involves successful structural reform, where Germany implements painful but necessary changes to restore competitiveness through bureaucratic simplification, massive digital infrastructure investments, energy policy rationalization, and social system modernization that accommodates demographic realities while maintaining political stability. This optimistic scenario requires political courage that Germany's current fractured political landscape seems unlikely to provide, given that necessary reforms would impose significant short-term costs on powerful constituencies while offering benefits that might not materialize for years or decades. Historical precedents suggest that democracies rarely implement such comprehensive changes voluntarily unless facing immediate existential threats that Germany's gradual decline has not yet provided. The second scenario envisions managed decline where Germany maintains European leadership while accepting permanent loss of global economic relevance and industrial competitiveness. German living standards would remain high by global standards, but the country would evolve from an export powerhouse into a comfortable but economically peripheral European nation that influenced regional affairs while playing minimal roles in global economic competition with China and the United States. This scenario offers political stability and social cohesion while acknowledging that Germany cannot compete with countries that combine larger markets, lower costs, more flexible regulations, and more aggressive innovation policies. Managed decline represents a rational adaptation to changing global circumstances, though it requires psychological adjustments that may prove politically and culturally difficult for a nation accustomed to economic leadership and engineering supremacy. The third and most troubling scenario involves systemic European crisis, where Germany's economic decline triggers continental instability that undermines European integration while empowering authoritarian movements throughout Europe. Without German economic strength to anchor the Eurozone and fund European institutions, the entire continental project becomes vulnerable to external pressures and internal divisions that could fracture decades of integration achievements. This catastrophic scenario would reshape global geopolitics by eliminating Europe as an independent power center while consolidating the world into a bipolar competition between American and Chinese. Fears of influence. European countries would face stark choices between American and Chinese alignments rather than maintaining the strategic autonomy that European integration was designed to preserve and enhance. The global implications extend beyond European geopolitics into fundamental questions about democratic governance in an era of rapid technological change and intensifying international competition. Germany's experience suggests that democratic systems may struggle to implement long-term strategic planning when electoral cycles reward short-term thinking and interest group pressures prevent necessary but painful adjustments to changing economic realities. The speed of Germany's decline also reveals how quickly established economic relationships can become obsolete when technological disruption combines with geopolitical instability and strategic miscalculations. Countries that consider themselves permanently prosperous may discover that economic success requires constant adaptation and strategic foresight rather than simply maintaining existing advantages through incremental improvements and bureaucratic inertia. For other developed economies, Germany's experience provides a sobering case study in how competitive advantages can erode when governments prioritise ideology over economic realities. The combination of energy policy disasters, regulatory complexity, and geopolitical miscalculations that undermine German competitiveness could afflict other countries that assume their prosperity is permanent. Ultimately, Germany's great collapse represents much more than one European economy's decline. It symbolises the broader challenge facing democratic societies that must compete with authoritarian systems capable of implementing long-term strategies without electoral constraints. Whether democratic systems can develop the institutional mechanisms necessary for strategic adaptation while preserving the freedoms that make democracy valuable remains an urgent question that Germany's experience has made an increasingly much more pressing and urgent.